Hello and welcome back to another tutorial on Power Pivot. This is Trisha Jaktiani, and in this tutorial I'm going to introduce you to two important terms used in pivot table and the Power Pivot. One is the explicit measure and the implicit measures. While both these measures are available in the pivot table and the Power Pivot, and we have used this day in and day out in the pivot table, we are not aware of the term that is used for this kind of calculation. Let's understand what is an implicit measure and what is an explicit measure in this tutorial. If I look at my database here, I have the information about the sales that is done for each of the countries. If I need to identify, if I want to perform a simple pivot table here, you know what happens when you create a simple pivot table? You do a simple calculation as well. So as of now, I'm going to show you how does that work when we have a simple pivot table. So here in this simple pivot table, you have four quadrants, which we have already seen in my previous tutorials on Excel. In the four quadrants, you know that the last quadrant is the place, or the values is the quadrant where all the calculations are done. So if I drag and drop any of these calculations, say sales, and drop it to your Excel, automatically identifies that it is number and it picks up as a sum of sales. Now what is happening here is it is automatically picking up a calculation, and that calculation is the sum. This is called as an implicit measure. Why? Because Excel automatically picks up a particular calculation, which because you dropped it there and gives you the information here. You have some options of changing that calculation by going on to this and value field setting and changing this, but this stays as implicit. Name that you have here, you cannot really change the name of this. It's not very easy to change the name. You have to follow a few instructions to that. So the implicit measure is not very user friendly for few reasons. One is it stays as a sum of sales. If you want to do a count of sales, you will have to add one more and then call it count of sales. So you have one of count, one is sums. Now, if you want to use it in any other pivot table, you will have to do this calculation again in the values column. So that means it cannot be reused. It has to be done over and over time you want that data. That's the issue with the implicit measure. And that's why we have created, or the Excel has one more option available where we create our calculation through the field items and set, which is called as the calculated fields. From this calculated field, whatever calculations that you create is called as your explicit measure. Why do you call it an explicit measure? Because when you create a calculation into this field, this will add as a new measure or as a new data in your field, or as a new field in your data, sorry, in your pivot table list. Let's see sales. Let's say I'm saying 10% of the sales as commission. So I'll call sales into 10% and it will give me the commission here. So I would call it 10% and I say okay, and you can see that it is added as a new field. Of course, I have that option to add whatever name I need in the first place itself, which is not available for me in the values column. You can change it, but at a later stage, and it is not very easy to change those names here. While for this one, you can always give the name that you want to give in the field, and this field will stay here and you can add it to other pivot tables as well. So it becomes simpler and it is explicitly available for other pivot tables as well. Now, why am I showing it here? Because it is a simple pivot table. Why am I showing it in the Power Pivot window? Because when you are looking at the calculated fields, you can easily create measures inside the calculated fields here. Why am I saying that? When you're creating the calculated field, that is actually picking up as a measure in the Power Pivot itself. Excel pivot table has given you that option in the field items and set to create that calculated field in a simpler way rather than going into the Power Pivot. So anyways, I'm going to go into the Power Pivot and see how that measures are created there. So like we had already seen the different ways to create measures here, which you can go through the Power Pivot window, through the pivot table, and we are going to see when you create that measure in the Power Pivot window, it allows you to do a lot of things over just using it on your data here.
Congratulations on completing the business dashboard using Excel course. Ready to elevate your career? Join our postgraduate certificate in data science and AI and gain exclusive benefits like a complimentary Python programming bootcamp, 7 plus case studies, dedicated student support, and access to our job opportunities portal. Don't miss out on this chance to transform your career. Invest in yourself today and join our program. Click on the link in the description to enroll now and take the next step in your career journey.
So I'm just going on to the manage window to see where do you have that data. So here I do not have the data, so I'll have to add it to the model. Again, this is a single data set, so it is only going to show one data set in the database, which was not very user friendly. So I'm just going to show you one more data set, which it will have the relationship model also. And here you go, you have the data here which is given here. You can create the measure your way, the way you want to. You can also do the calculation and then create the measures, and these calculations with the measures will stay with you throughout any other pivot table that you create. So it becomes very simple for you to use these kind of measures. So for example, if I want to identify what is the 10% of the sales, I can easily do that by doing a multiply by 10%. And then if I want to do more calculations also, you are aware that we can do that. Very simple ways to do that. Sorry, in Power Pivot, well, like I had mentioned earlier, it doesn't pick up the percentage sign. So I have to do divide by 100. Once I have done that, it is doing the calculation of the whole field, and then now I can create a measure which says the new revenue that I have generated. So I can say measure name, whatever I need to give it. I'm just going to call the sum of calculated columns 1, which I have not given the name as yet. So this becomes my new measure, which is the calculated column 1. I can always change the name if I want to, so that just tells me that this is the commission. Now sales minus commission is going to be my total revenue or the net revenue that I have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to further do the calculation saying sum of sales minus the new calculated column, sum of calculated columns that I have here, and I need to close the bracket in the middle so that it takes the sum there. Now this becomes my new measure here, and if you want to see the calculation, you can easily see that through the. Now this gives me the number of the data that you have, the sum of sales minus the sum of the calculated columns, and this is the total that you get here, which is fine. You got a perfect answer that you were looking for. My worry here is when you am looking at this data, this is the total of this minus the total of this. This is what the answer that is giving. What if I do not want it in a particular formatting? You can always go on to the home tab and format it in the way that you want, which is possible in your implicit measures as well, but that is not that user friendly. You have to actually go through the whole process to understand that. So here, once you have created it and you go back and try to add that to your pivot table, it will become very simple to add that to the pivot table. But before that, you will need to have your pivot table in the data model. So in the data model, for that I'll click on the more tables and click on yes, and it will create a new pivot table for me, and my data will contain the measure 1. So now this measure 1, I can use it in any other pivot table as well. I'm not restricted to use this particular measure, which is the FX measure. FX means it is calculated column, or this is the function, or this is the calculated field that we have done through the Power Pivot. So whenever you see an FX in front of your measure name, you will identify that this is something that you have calculated through the Power Pivot, and this is the explicit measure which you can use it in any other pivot table as well. So again repeating, this is where you just drag and drop, that is called as your implicit measure. The one that you create or do the calculations, that is called as your explicit measure. Explicit measures have more options where you can do multiple calculations inside that, advanced calculations you can do that, any other things that you want to perform, any other functions that you want to perform inside the measure can be done using the Power Pivot method, and that is called as the explicit measures, and can be used in any of your pivot table that you create, but for the implicit measure you have to keep repeating that particular creating that particular measures. So hope you found this tutorial useful, and you will use this terms to create and work on your databases. Thank you for watching.